permissions to make the change. So we're making changes, but they're not being green lighted from your end.
So you can't see them publicly,
But we'll address
which is a
that.
problem.
Tom is getting the green light to be able to do that on Friday.
Yes.
He is trained and has access on Friday. So
Okay.
The good news is I have my NC State email.
Okay.
Dr. Evans, will you call the roll, please?
Dr. Bullock, Dr. Dempsey, that's okay. Dr. Fleming, Ms. Janeski, Mr. McKinney, Ms. Morris,
Here.
Dr. Graham, Dr. Houston, Mrs. Jones, Mr. Lockus, Dr. Locklear, Dr. Marr,
Here.
Dr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. Weddington, Dr. Wood, Dr. Wood? He's here. I think Dr. Wood's trying to say here or present. And Mr. Wallace. Oh. Well, I don't know.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the January 16th, 2020 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation and licensure programs. My name is Patrick Miller, and I'm chairman of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you've had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the January 16th, 2020 meeting? Have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, those in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The agenda has been approved. Thank you. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on December 12th, 2019 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes? We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from December 12th, 2019. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. The minutes have been approved. I've now asked Dr. Andrew Seiberg to provide the State Board of Education and NCDPI updates, and then to move into the discussion and action on the EPP Accountability Model Proposal Report. Dr. Seiberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes.
Just give us, for those of you who are online, just give us 10 seconds to get the PowerPoint up because I'm leveraging that as the point of conversation. Okay, so we took the proposed Educator Preparation Program accountability model to the board last week. And what I've provided for you here is not the entire PowerPoint that I went through, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody had access to, sort of a basic understanding of what we went through. In the process, I made the case for House Bill 107 requiring this weighted model. If we go to we'll just kind of go through these. We proposed the weighted model as was outlined here from Pepsi. Then we went into the idea of trying to convert the raw scores into a composite score so that we could look at high achieving versus challenged programs and everything in between, and the idea of sort of steering clear of this is the 12th best program versus the 13th best program. Tried to make that case that this commission thought that was sort of an inappropriate way of comparing at that level of granularity. Then we moved on to this idea of, while the recommendation was for a 3-domain model, there was robust and rich conversation around a 4th domain in the issue of diversity, and helping to prime the idea of diversifying the teacher workforce going forward. Could this model be a catalyst for that in some way? And ultimately, the decision was, let's sort of investigate that going forward by collecting some of the data that we don't have access to, which includes Pell-eligible first generation and urbanicity of candidates, and then upon looking at that over a 2-year pilot, help make an informed decision that could maybe lead to including that in the weighted composite average. So that was brought up in the presentation as well. If we go to the next slide, I tried to make a really strong case here that at no point was there any dissension among members of the commission that promoting diversity is an important and vital process that needs to be continuously looked at to try and broaden and diversify the candidates and the pipeline. There's research that suggests that's important. The Leandro case made a case towards that as well. And I tried to sort of really carefully frame the rationale behind the challenges associated with this decision. So if we go to the next slide, I brought up as it's currently laid out, what the model would look like, with 2 EPPs falling under the exemplary category level 4, a preponderance falling in level 3 and level 2, and to date none falling in the category of sanctioned. Then I thought it was helpful for the board to see how 107's accountability requirements compared to the model that's being proposed here. And so the next 2 slides are sort of walking through what are the differences between 107 versus what this past year's worth of work has come up with. So that's sort of an outline of what we talked about. I also shared that we'll be adding an EPP dashboard, which is going to give visualization representation of all the measures that we're collecting. We're starting with about 20 different about 20 different pages worth of visualizations. Our new colleague, Dr. Andy Baxter, has been working behind the scenes with SAS, trying to get that up and running. We expect to have that up and running about the same time that the formal performance reports and report cards will be made public. It'll be in sort of the the goal is to have all of this stuff, land on the board's to-do list to actually approve formally in April. So we'll expect that these things will be coming up in March. So that's sort of our time frame to get all this stuff in front of them.
Dr.
Yes.
Cyber,
Yes.
are any of the EPP folks involved in just reviewing some of those, or
Yes. So again, we have
the dashboard? I mean,
so the EPP dashboard, it's going to be a sort of a living document. So just to help level set for everybody in the commission here, the idea of visualizing data is a fairly complex process, and you can look at things any one of 1,000 different ways, and you can inadvertently cause things to be alarming when they shouldn't be alarming, or not. So it's like type 1, type 2 error, right? You could say things are not really a problem when in fact they are a big problem. So what Dr. Marr is asking is, can we have some input in this process? And the answer is yes. We are not quite ready for that, but we're a couple of weeks away. Once we get the initial slug of stuff put together, we will host a variety of stakeholders in that process, and then there'll be a continuous process as we hear from the field. It would be great if we could do X, Y, and Z. That's fine. Our obligation is to meet the spirit of the law, which is to satisfy the reporting components first, at the very basic level, and then diversify that as we get more time under our feet to expand and try and make it really useful, not just for the universities and the EPPs, but also make it useful for the LEAs as they think about hiring, and to provide different lenses depending on how that data could be leveraged out in the field.
I mean, I just think we've had instances in the past with the other dashboard, for example, that data would be presented, and you had folks with PhDs who didn't understand what the data was saying, and certainly like that's not helpful to anyone. And so I just wanted to make sure that the data that gets publicly presented, EPPs had an opportunity to look at that and say, yeah, this is really useful. Yes, I understand what this is saying or trying to say, or no, this doesn't really make sense when we
Right.
look at this one.
Totally agree with that. And to your point, I think one of the things that we have to grapple with here at the department is not just creating the dashboards, but to create maybe some 5-minute webinars, some training sessions to help standardize and help people out in the field really understand what they're looking at, how to use the data effectively, and how to avoid pitfalls, how to use the data responsibly. So that's a part of the core mission. I know we haven't gone deeply into this discussion, but that's where we're headed on the EPP dashboard front. So with that then, I summed everything up as Pepsi recommendations, the 3-domain model, adjusting the application of sanctions to the weighted composite model, using the same timeline that was outlined in 599, which is kind of a staggered approach. It's basically the idea of, let's not just inflict this new strategy on EPPs right out of the gate, but instead let's give them a couple years worth of data so that if they're having problems, they can react to it and they can adjust to it in a responsible way. And so none of that would change, and then collect additional data to consider a 4th domain, which ultimately we would have a point of a data set that we could look at growth over time in 2022. So that's what was said at the board, and now I'd like to walk you through some of the responses that we heard from board members, and just sort of give you an opportunity to discuss or consider any responses to some of these things that were brought up in the board meeting. And I know there are folks that are in this commission that were also at that meeting as well. So if you'd like to chime in, I'm looking at Mr. McKinney. But if there, and I don't know if Tabari is on as well, but if there are folks that would like to share in addition to what I'm sharing here, I'm happy to yield the floor. So the first area, and this of course was predictable, there was concern from multiple members that the domain 4 was not included, and there was a little bit of frustration around the idea that it would take so long for us to actually collect that data and be able to look at it carefully enough to make a decision going forward. So some of the things that came up in that discussion are listed here on this slide. One is that, is there a rationale for putting it in now versus later on with maybe not a lot of weight, and then adjust the weight later on as we get more data to come in. That was one of the things that was brought up. A second was, is there a way to incorporate institutional diversity policy somehow into the model as a measure, right? So how are the broader universities attracting diverse candidates to the profession, and could that be somehow incorporated in? And then the third is lack of diversity due to ineffective educator preparation programs or a lack of interest in non-white populations to become teachers for another reason, right? So in other words, is there a reason, if we assign this to the EPPs, it may not be where the problem is, right? So is that a potential hazard as well, that we are unwittingly teeing up something that doesn't have the kind of traction that would be desired? So before we go into some other areas that were discussed, I just want to take a step back and just get a sense of what the response is, because just so you all have clarity in this process, I presented to the board this item as a discussion item. You are getting the response, you're hearing from their perspective the concerns here, and I have to go back to the board for a vote in February. And I think this commission has a responsibility to consider what the board is saying, and you can continue to head down the same path that was initially championed here, right, and voted upon. Or you could see some of this feedback and say, oh, yeah, we hadn't considered that. Maybe we should think about a modification here. But I just want to give you guys the opportunity to hear some of these things and react to that in case there's some reason for change in the direction we're headed.
Just a question of
Sure.
clarity. Once the state board does vote to approve whatever iteration of this, does it then have to be approved by the General Assembly?
So let me walk you. It's later on in my little presentation here, but point of clarity. I just heard yesterday. You haven't even seen this yet. I heard from one of the state superintendent's lawyers, who is in the place of Cecilia Holden right now, that the JLEOC has requested us to actually do a presentation to the JLEOC in February. So that will be happening. So it's not just the formal report that I've drafted that you all have a copy of. We will do some sort of a formal presentation there. So at the point at which it gets to the board has the right to thumbs down, and if they thumbs down, I will have to go to the JLEOC and say, this is where we're at to date, and the board has issues, and I'll state the issues that I'm stating to you right now, and it's somewhat unresolved, and that's where we'll have to go. I imagine I would reach out to leadership, Representative Horn, and say it's been thumbs down, and so technically it comes formally back to Pepsi for one more process before they can make their decision in terms of the standard processes. And would you like for me to present now, or do you want to wait another month or two until that process runs its full course? But they don't have to react to this. What's in 107 is currently the law, right? So if they choose to pick this up in July, and the JLEOC decides to do something with it at that point, that's when it would happen. So they're not obligated to do something with this at February 15th. What we are obligated to do is hand them a report February 15th. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so given this first slide here, are there any thoughts or reactions to some of the things that were brought up? And again, Mr. McKinney, if you have anything that if I'm not accurately representing, or if I've missed something, please jump in.
I think you represented that well, and I think the third bullet is really one of the points of how do we balance how to effectively measure an APP versus how are we recruiting and how we're providing opportunities for teachers at the high school level, maybe even as early as the middle school level, to be attracted to the profession, and then particularly with an equity lens on that. So I think that third bullet was one we really had a lot of discussion surrounding.
And Andrew, I would say just from an HR perspective, I'll go back to the third bullet as well. I'm not sure how we can hold an EPP accountable for recruiting diversity into their programs when there are other obstacles and barriers outside of an EPP that prevent them from entering that. It does go back more to a recruitment, whether that's something that's legislated, like teaching fellows. There's just other barriers and obstacles, and it's hard for me to say I want to hold an EPP accountable for increasing the diversity in the teacher ed programs. Now, I understand the domino effect because we try to increase our diversity in our classrooms, but it's a much bigger problem than just trying to force an EPP through an accountability measure to say, we want you to have more diversity in your teacher ed programs. Because the folks have to be available. It has to be an incentive for folks to come into teaching. And I think historically, and I don't have any research to back this up other than experience, historically what we've seen as in HR is those HBCUs that are producing small groups of teacher educators, they accept positions that are much more lucrative outside of going into the classroom and teaching. So it's a much bigger issue now. Some of them may be on the call and refute that, but I see that they have much bigger options than going in, and I don't mean better options, I just mean bigger options that are more lucrative than necessary. It may be research-based, it may be university-based, it may be business-based, but they have other options. So I think those have to be dealt with before we start saying, EPP, this is all on you. You have got to recruit people into your programs, and we want to measure you by this percentage. Now, Michael, some of you will maybe able to say that better, but.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, that there are plenty of options for candidates or for particularly for students of color outside of education that pay quite a bit more in some instances. I think in my time at NC State, I certainly saw that. It was difficult to recruit students out of an engineering major and into an education major.
And I also feel that we really need to revisit the opportunity here to suggest teacher cadet programs, to suggest I feel like there's where that balancing act really could be addressed.
I think that's a great contribution. So one of the things that we're working on behind the scenes, and we will share with the subcommittee, the committees that have been working on this, the leads on that, is sort of a list of, here are some strategies that the JLEOC might want to consider if in other words, if we go down the path of EPPs being held accountable to something like diversity going forward, there should be other supports in place, not just this one particular thing, to help get more traction. And so my hope is that the subcommittee chairs will be able to get that, mustered together so that we can share that with the JLEOC as well. So yes. Other thoughts on this?
Andrew, we may want to come back to it and get to the report. In that.
Okay. Sure. Any other thoughts before I move to the next topic of discussion? So let's go to the next slide. So the next point that was brought up from board members was concern that the current model has 0 sanctioned EPPs. I think this was JB that brought this up. And this idea of, can we leverage this model in a way that helps incentivize EPPs to improve. And if we're saying that the point of incentivization would be at the level 1, and we don't have anybody in the level 1 sanctions, is that a problem? should we, so then the question was brought to us, should we look at different weighting for the, a month from now when I come back in February, can we look at different weights associated with domain 1, domain 2, domain 3 to see how this stuff plays out? And I think did you attach that? So you can see in there I've done a variety of different lenses there. And say that again? Right. So we have these 4 levels of sanctions. I guess the question that is brought up is, how does this incentivize the existing setup? Does level 2, does level 3, does the transparency of it being on an EPP dashboard, and I put it to the institutions, do you all seek the idea of, or credence that, yeah, we are at the very highest tier, or is the only incentive here not to be in the doghouse, not to be a level 1 sanction? I'm only looking at Dr. Marr because he's the only university person that I can look at here. But I think the other thing, and I did not bring this up in the presentation, it was a very complex thing to share at the board, but one thing I neglected to say was how, in our sanctions conversation with Dr. Dempsey and some of the work behind the scenes was, we did require actionable steps for a level 2 program to improve, for a level 3 program to improve. So it's not as if the only thing that's going to cause, a reaction from an EPP is if you're going to be sanctioned. So that was something I didn't share. I can certainly go back and share this idea of, when you're on a different level system, there are still things that you can be doing for self-improvement, to improve your programs, to help, bolster the quality of your candidate and the outcomes. And it's perhaps sharing that sort of structure may help mitigate this concern. But anyway, so that's the second point that was brought up, and I yield to the commission members here if you'd like to discuss that.
So can I just ask a question? Sure. And I know that people cannot see, but I'm looking at the sanctions list here.
Yep.
And Andrew, I'm going to go back to the domain 4 and kind of put that on here as an example. So level 1 on the sanctions list for an EPP, if we add the domain 4 with diversity and they're not meeting whatever that measurement is, so now we're going to give them a warning that, because they cannot increase their diversity within their program, and we're going to put them on an action plan for continuous improvement so they can move towards proficient to increase the diversity.
Yep.
And we're going to send out a peer technical assistance from maybe DPI or wherever. Mm-hmm. So what are we going to do? So what would DPI do to help the university increase their diversity in an education program?
Yeah,
or what
right
would
now,
you do to help me increase it in my classroom? And I mean that just like, if I'm looking at that, that's going to be the question that I want to know is, what are you going to do to help me with that?
No, I agree. We have very limited, we have, without legislative assistance in this process, we have very limited capability. Now, I will say this. I think it's really important to understand this. I cannot envision an environment in any scenario where an EPP would be put on sanction only because of domain 4. Like that would not happen. Domain 4 would be one of multiple things that would be not working within an EPP. And so I think the idea is that domain 4 would contribute to a holistic perspective of the effectiveness of an EPP program. It's one of multiple measures. So I just want to be careful that, my suspicion is that if you are a sanctioned EPP, there are a lot of things structurally not working. It's possible that the quality of instruction or the curriculum that you're providing needs support or changes. There are other things that are going to be at play, not just the fact that you didn't meet one particular target of diversity.
So it'd be somewhat similar to a teacher evaluation then, where I have multiple standards and I may be developing or not demonstrated in this particular domain, but then I have an overall rating that I'm actually proficient, or at least proficient, because if I have a developing or not demonstrated in a standard, I really shouldn't be overall proficient, but that's what I'm relating that back to for an EPP when I'm thinking about the individual domains.
Well, and I think this is a key difference. And for those of you who weren't on the subcommittees, this is probably not on your radar, but this is a key difference between the way 107 is currently worded and the model that we're proposing. The way the way 107 and current law requires that you meet all subgroups, race, gender, ethnicity, for the 3 measures of accountability. And that means that if you fall short on any subgroup, you can get a sanction. And the overwhelming consensus of the 2 subgroups that we're working behind the scenes on this is we have to be careful that we're not unnecessarily teeing up huge programs who are going to have all these subgroups to be considered to potentially get sanctioned. Now we're damaging our pipeline, which is providing a preponderance of our teacher force because they can't meet one particular subgroup. And that doesn't mean that isn't a problem, but should you potentially cut off an entire EPP for only one slice of a broader picture that's overall healthy? So,
Andrew?
yeah, yes, please, Dr. Dempsey. Mm-hmm.
No problem. Also, as a policy question, and just in my head now, snarky. So let's say we follow through on the bullet that should come into be under sanction, and we come to the conclusion the answer is yes. The EPP can still run their academic program, and that person still completes it. They just aren't eligible for certification. But they're going to be the next step higher after people who complete the certification. So it's not as if they're not going to, people who graduate from those institutions aren't going to be teachers. They're going to go into clinical residency, and more than likely they're the best clinical residency option that a school district or a school would have. So I think, going back to Mr. Buxton's concern, it's a lot more complicated in North Carolina right now than whether or not somebody's always underwater.
So,
It's going to be really complicated. Not to stop people who otherwise would have been denied recommendation for licensure from becoming teachers.
yes.
In the current situation.
I think he's done. All right.
This is Hank. Just follow, I think Andrew's idea of sharing that we're actually going to take actionable steps based on your level is really important for them to hear, to understand that what we're trying to make this is something that's beneficial to EPP so that we can continue to improve and look at our performance year over year and try to get better. That's how we, I think, want this set up as opposed to a gotcha. And if I'm hearing what Representative Ford's saying correctly, he says this is not about sanctions and it's not about a big stick. It was about trying to help EPPs perform better and for us to get the best teachers out there possible. So I think that discussion would be really important for you to have with the board.
Okay.
We could reverse engineer this any way we wanted to, right? We could set these weights to make sure that we had a certain percentage of folks being sanctioned each year. I don't know how that necessarily is in the sphere that's helping our EPPs improve their performance at this point.
And it doesn't help the state.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I take issue with the assumption that's being made here, right? And I think the underlying assumption, whether it's intended or not, is that EPPs are not interested in continuous improvement, right? So that's what's being put out if the idea here is that a level 2 isn't good enough for someone to take action, when I think that's entirely false. I mean, I know a lot of folks who work in EPPs, they take a lot of pride in their work. No one would want to be a level 2 program, regardless of whatever that means. So that's one issue I have. The other issue is I feel like there's an intent here to kind of move the goalpost, right? So we've established some criteria. We've said, this is the criteria, here's what we expect. Oh, but now that it seems that nobody seems to fall into one, let's move it and make it a little bit more difficult so that somebody does fall into one. That doesn't make sense to me. The other piece is, I think the data that's been borne out to this point is only traditional EPP, is that right? It does not include any of the alternative paths, non-traditional providers, so.
Yeah, we have very limited data because they're relatively
Right.
new, yeah.
So we're looking at data, and we have been making the claim for years that the most effective teachers in North Carolina are prepared by in-state EPPs, public and independent. And if the data is now bearing that out, perhaps we're right. And so you're getting about a third of the new teachers in North Carolina who are coming through traditional pathways. So 2/3 aren't even being measured. And so this equation of teacher effectiveness or the state of the profession and putting that all on the back of EPP, of traditional EPPs in particular, is false, right? So I do have some real concerns. I do think I would prefer that we not tinker with this model anymore and arbitrarily try to make programs seem as though they should be sanctioned when in fact the data to this point doesn't suggest they should be sanctioned. So, yeah, I have some other things I could say about it, but I'll leave it at that. But I just think if this model were really about EPP continuous improvement, then members of the General Assembly would have come to EPPs in the first place and worked with us to develop a model instead of creating a model and then putting it on us and then coming back and saying, oh, well, by the way, why don't you figure this out because this is what we think is important. So it wasn't really about that at the start. I think it was really about sanctioning programs.
Michael, to your point, and Andrew Lakers, I'm gonna put words in your mouth. When we were working through this in the subcommittee stage, I think one of the things that was consistent in those conversations was we need to be focused on presenting to the General Assembly what we think is best to do, not what we think they want. So I agree with your, with the point, and I think we gotta do that. I think we gotta propose the best model we can propose. And I think that's in the intent of this work, at least from the subcommittee.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that.
Any other thoughts about this slide?
Have you got some more slides?
I got
One more concern.
Okay, go ahead.
it's okay.
Yep.
So the last one here, and this one we haven't really fleshed out within the two subcommittees, and I want to draw your attention to it. As I was, we did the presentation, and I went back and you sort of marinated on all the things that were being discussed. One of the things that comes to mind for me that is concerning is the current sanctions progress and the speed at which it takes place, right? So if we identify, if you're an EPP, essentially you're getting somebody, particularly at a institution, you're getting somebody in the junior year. It takes you 2 years to get them through a process, and essentially 1 year to collect data on them out in the field to see whether your outcome measures are going to be, that what you're doing is effective. So if your program is ineffective and you are sanctioned out of the gate, year one, you get a warning. Okay, so now I'm going to do everything I can to change my curriculum. I'm going to, turn myself into a pretzel to do a total 180 on the process. You may be revoked before you see the impact of your outcomes. And that is troubling to me as a person who has to manage the behind the scenes here. So in other words, the point at which you start, and again, this can be, we have to think carefully about how this plays out on the sanctions side of things. So one of the things that was brought up, I talked with Dr. Tomberlin about this, was this idea of maybe a safe harbor. That once you've been identified as a sanctioned EPP, you get a warning status. The idea is that you then can play ball within a certain range of your weighted model, and you're held to that as long as you don't continue to erode from that point, that you wouldn't continue to go through probation and revocation. because there are real concerns in actualizing this, that once you start this path, you could potentially not get out of it in the way it's currently set up. Is that making sense? Does anybody have any thoughts about instituting or implementing some sort of a safe harbor, or making a suggestion around a safe harbor, or other strategies to consider? I mean, the thing that I'm concerned about is, and Dr. Tomlin expressed this concern as well, is we don't want to tee up this idea of that you can be in sanction for so many years. You know, that's not effective either. That, oh, I've been in warning status and I get, 6 years to get this thing turned around. That is not, that's sending the wrong message as well. But at the same time, in its current setup, I think there are some challenges associated with that.
So Andrew, do you have any examples, and you don't have to name the particular EPP, but do you have data to support how many in-state universities have actually ended up with a warning and then have been placed on probationary status, or
Right.
had a revocation take place?
So let's be clear here. That so there was a process in place prior to this whole accountability input and the change in law and all that. And basically, it was hinged on pass rate data. The percentage of pass rates had to be at 70% or higher on licensure area exams. And this was causing problems in the EPPs because of the math tests that we have talked about, to the nth degree over the past year and a half or so. And so what you're seeing in the current model is we don't have pass rates as a portion of that. And it got more complex because pass rates became more convoluted as a measure for an outcome, because people had 2 years and now 3 years to pass the exam. So really, for us to look at pass rates, we have to look at a cohort back in 15-16 for the current year, because you have to give them the full 3 years of time to actually take and pass the test. So then you start to ask the question, well, if somebody passes the test 3 years from the point at which they come out of the institution, is that really an accurate representation of the quality of their program, right? So where you draw the line on pass rates is very complicated. But I can say that with the current, we've run the analysis, the current setup, given the current data and the ranges that were set up, there would be nobody that was falling into warning status. And my conversations with Title II folks at the federal level, they would issue a warning if they see low pass rates over a 3-year period as well. And I'm not getting that feedback from them either. So for the most part, what I'm seeing is that the EPPs, by and large, are producing outcomes that are meeting at least the federal Title II guidelines. And in our current model, they would be meeting that standard by staying at a level 2 or higher.
Yeah, well, and you've got a majority of programs in the state are also going through accreditation. And so their accreditation cycle would also fall somewhere within this period. So they're either collecting data and submitting reports, or they're actually going through, or they're a year post. So.
Other thoughts about this idea, about this potential challenge on the sanction side of things? I just feel compelled. If I were to present to the JLEOC today, I would just as the person that has to do the work behind the scenes, I would feel compelled to tell them that the way sanctions are currently set up right now, if you are sanctioned, it is going to be hard for you to dig out in the short time period that you've been given. And at revocation, you're not allowed to take in any students. So there comes a point at revocation that you can't even demonstrate at that point.
Well, I like the idea of a safe harbor. I just would really like to hear what the EPPs think about that notion, because what we don't want is if this has the possibility of impacting our teacher pipeline, right? We have teachers in the program, and all of a sudden, of course, would that impact how would that impact?
So,
I can understand losing accreditation.
Yeah,
but
I'm looking at the actual measures, right? And so what are the measures that it would take time to fix And so some of them are hard to figure out, right? So NESIS and EVOS, I'm not sure what an EPP would do, right? If that's where they were falling short. If you are falling short on EdTPA, PPAT, certainly within a year or two, you could figure out some fixes to try to figure out where your students are falling short and put some things into place. 1 year retention is another one of those. I'm not quite sure how you fix that. And graduate surveys, certainly if you started getting surveys back and your graduates were unhappy with their preparation, then likely you're going to do some things pretty quickly. But as Chairman Miller and I were talking about, I mean, if essentially we could get to a point where we are on a warning, perhaps a 2-year probation, before we get to a revocation, that I think that probably would be more agreeable. So you have a little bit of a longer ramp to do some improvement.
I'm sorry, could you explain that one more time?
Yeah, so if you were year 1 warning, year 2 and 3 probation, year 4 became your
Oh, to stretch it out a little bit longer?
Stretch it out a little bit longer to give EPPs time to work on that data. Or to work on that issue, I guess.
So that's an alternative to potentially a safe harbor kind of thing, but just to give probation a longer window.
What would a safe harbor look like?
It's just, and again, I don't want to put words in Dr. Tomlin's mouth because he's really the statistician guru behind the scenes here. But the idea would be that if you fell below, the way the current setup is established is if you fall below a weighted score of 25, right, that you would then be sanctioned. So the point, let's say an institution was at like 23, mm-hmm. that he would then set a safe harbor for X number of years. That, yeah, you are under warning or you're now under probation in this process. Provided you don't continue to go down, you have more time to actually implement. That you're sort of frozen in time there. Yep. We're not gonna keep ratcheting up for this very reason. So, and I think there are probably 100 ways that you could think about that, but essentially it's doing the same thing as what you're proposing, which is just to lengthen the amount of time. I just worry about the image that it sends, this idea of lengthening it too far, then you end up having, an infinite amount of time to
I agree with that.
To tinker. Yeah. So you're still in favor of maybe adding a year under the probation side of things? Okay.
Or if the others are more amenable to this idea of safe harbor, I'd be fine with that as well.
Andrew, does the idea of safe harbor, so let's say I go on warning in year 1 and you give me a safe harbor for however long we decide that is. During that time, let's say years 2 and 3, do I still come up under warning? Do I stay out there on the public dashboard as an institution under warning, or are you saying the safe harbor makes that invisible while we're working on the issues?
Well, I mean, if you've been sanctioned, that has to be publicly acknowledged, right? So the sanction would be in play as long as you've been sanctioned. But in terms of safe harbor, I mean, that how we hold that, we would have to amend policy to set the expectations under the sanctions, which I think is TCED 13 or 008. It's one of it's the sanctions policy. We would have to lay out what that would look like, and that would be. I mean, I think at this point, whatever I have to present to the JLEOC is going to be, we're still tinkering with this idea, because it's going to take too long for us to put together. I'm just raising a cautionary flag that the sanctions are a little on the fast side.
And that's in the statute, right? 107.
Yeah, that's correct. Mm-hmm.
So can I ask one more question? Sure. There? So going with this idea of, and I'm very limited in my knowledge around this, Andrew, but if they fall below 25, that's when the warning kicks in. Mm-hmm. Let's just use that number because you did. So if it kicks in, they're at 23, mm-hmm. and it kicks in that they're in warning. If we have a safe harbor number, then
a range or something, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
If you fall within this range and this range, as long as you don't drop anymore over the next couple of years, right, you're going to stay in that warning. I'm just keeping it's going to stay classified as a warning status. You're not dropping to probationary unless you fall below that range. Will we set an outlier date or an end date for that?
Sure. You would not be in safe harbor in perpetuity, right? Like you would, but the point is to allow the opportunity for institutions and EPPs to be able to try and put their best foot forward to cause some positive change, right? We presuppose that we're going to be able to turn an EPP around very quickly. It's very complicated work, and it takes time, and that's the concern here is the length of time.
I think I would support safe harbor, but I'd want to know, what's the time frame, right?
Right. Sounds like that's probably more work maybe at the subcommittee level to do some tinkering on that. But is it, at this point, if I were to present to the board that I could bring this up as a topic of concern and we're still working on that kind of thing? Is everybody okay with that?
I think that's safe to say.
Andrew might try to come up with another phrase to safe harbor.
Sure.
Yeah, conditional status or something. Safe harbor almost sounds like somewhere you want to.
Right.
Safe harbor
What
was
we
a
use.
term we used in No
No
Child Left Behind. So
yeah.
that,
I kept thinking that.
Okay.
We liked it.
yeah, I like being in safe harbor.
All right. We do not want it to be. We don't want it to be a positive thing. No.
Yeah.
Okay. So, any other thoughts about that? And Chairman Miller, it sounded like you might have wanted to jump in at some point here.
I was just going to ask, are we done presenting the concerns and things? Were you going to talk about the weights or what? I think everybody felt like,
Could stay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine if there's nobody else wants to
Okay.
contribute.
All right, so the floor is open now for discussion on any and all of the concerns that you heard Dr. Seiberg mention this morning.
We're going to do the report following this discussion.
Okay.
So I guess I would like to know if the report's going to add some additional information where we might have concerns from that based on somebody's comment online. That's a,
You want me to go over the report real quick? So what we've added in here is a formal write-up of essentially what we're proposing to the JLEOC. And I didn't want to make this a prolonged discussion here. Essentially, what the JLEOC report does is lay out some context of the process, the amount of time and effort, and the level of severity that this commission and the stakeholders put into the process. It shares the thinking around the different domains. And then I think what's important to know in this process is it makes recommended changes to the what the legislative 107 is actually saying. And that's why it has to come back to Pepsi, because you all need to approve any changes in policy, that kind of stuff. In this case, this would be a change in law. But what you collectively need to understand is the only thing that we're doing in the JLEOC report is trying to do the minimal amount of effort to 107 to actualize the change, right? That's what 107 said. If there are any legislative changes that you could recommend to actualize your accountability model, make those recommendations, and that's what this report is doing. So my hope here is that what you'll see in there is it should all make sense to you, that it's literally just trying to change the things to actualize what was the intent of the accountability model from the start. Okay? And given that, does anybody have any questions about the report? My hope is that it's pretty straight ahead, and when you see it, you'll be like, yeah, that sort of follows what we did, and
It was basically just a narrative of
it's just a narrative. That's right, with the exception of the actual legislative changes.
So with that added information, does anybody want to share any more concerns or feedback or make any recommendations for changes to what we have already approved and sent to the state board? Hearing none, do we need to vote again to send the?
You would need to vote to approve the legislative changes in the report to go to the JLEOC.
Okay, but
It's-
not
it's-
to our original recommendations to
No.
the state board.
No, you're just recommending the legislative changes, and ultimately, when this meeting concludes, that the report will go to Deanna Townsend Smith, who will then send that out, because the board members know that the legislative change recommendations, which will actualize the recommended process, will be coming to them in between the meeting that I just had with them and February, so that in February, they will have to vote on the whole thing going over to
Okay.
the JLEOC.
So we're looking a motion to approve the EPP Accountability Model Proposal Report to be sent to the state board in February 2020 for discussion ahead of the JLEOC presentation. Do we have that motion?
So moved.
We have the motion. Do we have a second? Thank you. We have a motion and a second to approve the EPP Accountability Model Proposal Report. Is there any further discussion?
Was that second, Dr. Houston?
Dempsey, was not a
Thank you, Dr. Dempsey.
Hearing no further discussion, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
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 Are there any opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you. Appreciate that, Dr. Seiberg. Is that all your?
That's all. I know, I'm sorry, it was very complex, but
That's
I
okay.
appreciate everybody and all the work that's been going on today.
All right, Dr. Evans has a quick cut score update for middle school science praxis, I believe.
This is for LICN 003, and it is for the Praxis Middle School Science. And I want everybody to be able to see the current cut score is 150. And you can see here that a majority of states and even Guam have chosen 150. And you can see that there are only 3 outliers there. And this current cut score change just happened in January, so I don't know of any other states that have been voting on this to also have this cut score happen for middle school science test. There is a test code change. It would move from 5440 to 5442, and the new cut score would be 152. The 5440, that the current test is effective until August 2020, and then the new test 5442 would be effective beginning September 2020. Are there any questions about that?
And this is coming from the test.
This is coming directly from Praxis, and both reports are attached on the agenda.
Okay. Do we have a motion to approve the cut score?
So moved.
Have a motion. Do we have a second?
second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second to approve the new cut score for the middle school science praxis. Any further discussion? Hearing none, those in favor of approval, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carried. Thank you.
And this would go to State Board in March instead of February.
Is that for discussion in March for?
It would go for discussion in March, yes.
Okay.
All right. Next, please welcome Dr. Tom West, Vice President for Government Relations and General Counsel, who will present on the Digital Learning Initiative grants.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I understand I am between you and adjournment, so I'll try to move this along. Mr. Tomberlin asked that we make this report to you after seeing the report that was made at the state board meeting. So that's why I'm here. So if we can maybe move to slide. go back to the third. The work group that we've had involved in this has been, is here on this slide. Jackie Ennis from Barton, Patricia Fecker from Methodist, Betty Liberman from Shaw, Jennifer Russell from William Peace, Hank Weddington, who is on the phone, and I'm gonna, Hank, rely on you to talk about some of the substantive parts of this. And then Denise Adams, who formerly was the legislative staff member for all of the education committees at the legislature, is someone that we hired to coordinate the work group. So we can go to the next slide. The statute that started all of this off, passed back in 2017, made this a project that the UNC system was to undertake. And we were approached by the Friday Institute asking if we would become involved in it as well. And also key members of legislative committees on education asked that we become involved. So we did enter into a contract with DPI, and it's interesting, we're now in the third phase. The contract has been first with DPI, then the state board, and then back with DPI as some of the litigation issues went back and forth between the state board and DPI. But we're now in our third scope of work. If we can move maybe to slide 4, the next slide, I think. I've got some slides in here that just describe the 3 different phases, and I'll try to move through these pretty quickly. And I will say one of the things that has been important, very important to us, is to work with DPI, the Friday Institute, and the UNC system on this. Part of the challenge has been that we have moved through 3 different folks in the leadership positions at the UNC system as we've done our work. And Sean Bulson and I were working on it during this phase. Before we went under contract, Catherine Truitt and I were working on it. And then phase 2, Julie Cowell and I were working on it together along with our work groups. But I do really want to thank Sean and Julie for all of their collaboration on this. And it's been a challenge that we've dealt with. And we now have a work group of UNC deans that are very, very active in this process as well. But anyway, on phase 1, we were required to form a work group, hire a work group coordinator, also to host a symposium, and we did that symposium at Rowan Salisbury. They were very, very interested in collaborating with EPP deans and faculty on this issue. And keep in mind, the purpose of this was not to change the digital learning competencies that had already been adopted for in-service teachers. But the purpose of it was to help EPPs get their faculty trained in a meaningful way, so that EPP faculty are working with their students so that those students are prepared to be in-service teachers on digital learning, all in a seamless way with the digital learning competencies that were being developed. So one of the things that we wanted to do at this symposium was really observe some of the school systems that are doing a great job of digital learning. And we did field trips that day at several Rowan Salisbury schools, and then in subsequent phases we've done observations at other school systems. We were to, during this phase, deliver an outline of an initial plan of our development strategy, and we did that in late October of 2018. So if we can go maybe to phase 2. At that point, the question was, okay, so what do we do with this draft plan? And so we entered into a phase 2 contract from November of 18 through June of 2019. We submitted our report to the state board in late May, I believe, of 2019. And our requirement was to design and disseminate competencies for EPP faculty, develop and deliver that in conjunction with the Friday Institute, and then conduct an assessment and analysis of what EPPs are currently doing. And one of our concerns, of course, was that if we are spearheading this, and we have 31 EPPs among the independent colleges, and we're educating about a quarter of the teachers that go into the workforce in North Carolina, but we are not doing this with the UNC system. When we get to the end of this, this could just be a lot of work for nothing because there's not buy-in. So we have tried to work as closely as we can with the Friday Institute to be involved in the assessment process with the UNC system, and now with a work group of UNC faculty and deans. If we can go to maybe the next slide. So we did, and Hank, if you want to jump in, because I know you were very much involved in this, we did undertake a very aggressive literature review. Hank and the team developed surveys to send out through the Friday Institute to every EPP in the state. Also, we did a survey, I think, through the EPPs with faculty members, so that there could be an analysis by EPPs and faculty members of what kinds of things they needed some work on in digital learning. And I'm really trying to move through this pretty quickly. So we did that, and this is just kind of an overview. I'll go back into phase two in a little more detail. But we did that and presented our report, and there are links in this slide presentation to our report. One of the things I was really pleased that the work group did, and I have never been involved in a report where people did this as candidly as they did. When you look at the last couple of pages of the report, it has what I call a danger curve in it of what are the impediments to us actually being able to carry this out. And you'll see that there's an analysis of risk factors, and including lack of funding for what ultimately is the recommendation that there be a micro-credentialing badging system for EPP faculty to develop on kind of their own pace the skills that they feel like they need. And then by developing those skills, they get micro-credentials which show that they've moved along. So now we're in phase three. Our report at the end of phase three is due in June. We anticipate that we will get that out in April. That's partially because of the reality that faculty members tend to be focused on their students' final exam process and then other things for the at the end of the semester. So we anticipate getting that out in April. And as part of this process, we've had a very, very active collaboration with the UNC system work group. They met, I guess, Monday of last week, and they are very actively planning a symposium, which hopefully you all got invitations to, February 14th at Elon, and we've sent out invitations to about 160 people to host really just the continuation of the discussion about what EPP faculty need to be doing to continuously improve, a phrase that you used today, Mr. Marr, so that faculty can continuously improve their ability to work with their students so that their students can work with students that they will encounter in the classroom. So that meeting, February 14th, is well underway in planning. We can move maybe to the next slide. And this is where, Hank, if you want to jump in, that'd be fine with me, but if not, I'll just keep moving along.
Yeah, I'll be glad to just jump in real quick. One of the things that was really important to us, we looked at the digital learning competencies for K-12 teachers, and we spent, I would say, a few months going through and seeing which ones actually made sense for EPPs. expert in something, if you're writing the research on this field right now, which I know a lot of our faculty do in our programs, that you wouldn't have to do the same things. You could prove your competency through what you're already doing. If you were at a different level, at a more moderate level, or needed help in certain areas, that you could really focus in on that, that there would be a variety of different ways that you could meet those competencies, not just going through a digital badging system that was pre-created, but that badging system would include ways to earn badges or ways to earn micro-credentials that varied anything from attending conferences that you're already attending, things that happen at your home university in terms of professional development, things that you do online for professional development, or things that we offer up through this particular micro-credential site that you could use towards it. So we try to keep it as open as possible to make sure that it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's something that could help everyone, regardless of where they are on that spectrum of competence in this area.
And Hank, these 4 areas are the areas that the digital competencies will measure. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And if we can go to the next slide, this slide really just is to illustrate by using the meeting at Rowan Salisbury, the collaboration with the UNC system. The Friday Institute has just been incredible to work with in getting out the surveys to people. One of the things that we were able to do through their Qualtrics software is keep the responses anonymous. And we were really concerned, since there was a lot of self-reporting of what is my level of competence now, both as a program and as an individual, that we really wanted to make it as possible as we could that people would report accurately where their level was. And I think we had, I believe, 31 of the state's EPPs, 31 of ours, 15 of the UNC system, so 31 out of that group were very active in participating in getting this data back. And that data is attached as links to our report. So if I could maybe jump to slide 13, 34 EPPs, and this slide just really illustrates how people reported their current level of competency if we were using those 4 measures. And you can see that there's really a pretty significant group of folks that said that they were in the developing stage in their work. From that, let's go to the next slide. So our idea here is that first, you analyze where you are in terms of your competencies. Step 2 is that you enter into a continuous improvement plan, both as an EPP and as an individual. Then through this micro-credentialing system, you improve your skills. And then you kind of go back to the beginning, because this is a continuous process. And I think we all know that, particularly in the area of digital learning, this is not something where you're going to maybe learn about the history of the Roman Empire or learn Latin and that your work is done. So I think, frankly, one of the challenges that we've identified is that this is going to really require some funding, and I'll just jump ahead a little bit. Frankly, one of our ideas is also that one of the best ways to do this is to utilize the incredible resources that we have in our EPPs to maybe develop these types of micro-credentialing strategies in-house, rather than going out to contract and saying, well, why don't we purchase something? And I have talked a little bit about how maybe we can observe what the North Carolina Bar Association has done for 20 years with continuing legal education with a foundation, maybe observe what the North Carolina Medical Society has done with their continuing education, that type of thing, because they are very much an in-house driven program. I'll just go to slide 15 really quickly. So what we did is as I mentioned, we did a literature review. What we learned is that there is no cohesive guidance for EPPs. We learned that pre-service teachers need to be prepared by the faculty who use technology effectively. Because one of the things that people said about their own teaching style is that, particularly people of my age, is that they learned how to talk behind the podium. And they did not learn how to teach using the strategies that they want their students to know. And it was particularly interesting to me the day we went to a classroom in Rowan and Salisbury and watched a kindergarten teacher teach English as a second language to a classroom using an iPad. And I was so impressed with how prepared she had to be to create an environment that looked to an outsider like it was chaos. But she knew all day where she was going to be moving people. And there were 4 different groups of students in that room. And I think, just as an aside, I'll say I think sometimes one of the things that your profession really has to struggle with is that your best teachers make it look really easy when it really is very hard. So I'll move on beyond that. But we did want to also develop a strategy that ensures that these experiences are program deep and program wide, that everybody in the EPP is working on this, and that the EPP with faculty at different levels and different resources is able to prepare something that works for that particular EPP. So let's move on to maybe 2 more slides. Stick at that one a second. Hank, do you want to talk about, let's go back 1 slide. You want to talk about the next 2 slides, this one?
Sure, and I think most people probably know what this is. Public schools are doing it right now. I see the badging at elementary schools as I go around and see what's happening. So not a new idea. And, to give their credit, one of the first things that we saw, I think it was 2 years ago at NCAP, some of NC State's folks who were presenting on what they're using with their own teacher candidates to prepare them for meeting these digital learning competencies. And we saw that it looked a lot like a micro-credential system that they were using, and they shared it freely with everyone at that conference. We were able to take a look at that, and it made sense to us that might be the best way to go for our folks as well. Again, you can see the characteristics there. I won't read them to you, but I think the biggest thing that it's personalized learning, and that, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of ability or of competence, that there's a place for you, even if that place is, say we do create some kind of a foundation or whatever it happens to be able or afford to offer this ourselves. I mean, one of the things that we're going to really depend on are, one, the folks who are high achievers in this area, sharing content that could be used for others in their professional development. And we would call this a level of mastery in professional development and creating content that would be at the highest level.
Let's go to the next slide. And Hank, I think this pretty much is the slide that you were just talking about in a sense.
Right. That's a pretty slide. I like the colors there. One of the other things we talked about is that an EPP could go for a goal themselves. That by the end of this year, we want all of our faculty to be at a certain level, or a program within one of the domains, say assessment. We're really going to look at using digital tools this year for assessment, really explore those and do some professional development around that, and that the EPP kind of set themselves apart potentially by saying, we've all gone through this, and that's something you can put in your reports or accreditation materials. But it could also be a more personalized, each faculty his or her own confidence levels. That's, you know, not necessarily connected to what an EPP overall goal is for this. So again, trying to allow it to stay as free and flexible as possible so we don't feel pinned into we've got to check a box each year. But this is actually something that can help people improve in their performance as instructors.
And then the next slide is just an example of how a badging system would work, the steps that you would go through. And then the slide after that, I think, is just an example of what those badges could look like.
Right. And again, this is all still draft, and we're continuing to tighten this up, especially with the input of our UNC colleagues who are now part of this committee. So I think it'll probably look somewhat different by the time we reach the end, but this is kind of our starting place for what we were thinking about for the badges.
Yeah, and then I think the next slide is just a list of the folks that are now involved in this process. And one of the things that was really interesting is that we had pretty much with this group back in November planned out the symposium, and then with a holiday break and some more thought, I think this group spent several hours on Monday redesigning the symposium. So it's interesting when you get everybody together in a room talking about how is this going to look. It is very much an iterative process, and I'm sure that with the day that we spend, hopefully with really a robust participation, that we'll have a report in April that looks different than what we recommended this past June.
This is the one being hosted by Elon, correct? The February 14th one?
Yes, Elon is hosting, and that's correct. And the symposium, the registration is at no cost. And that is because we are just able to defray some of the expenses through the grant that we had gotten and the grant that UNC had gotten as well. I think that's it, Chairman, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for today's discussion. I remind commission members that our next monthly meeting will be held in this room on Thursday, February 13th from 9 to 12. We've now completed our meeting, and unless there's additional business, I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I have a motion and a second to adjourn. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
Yep. Yeah, I'm here. I had to drive to Charlotte tonight.